Hello and welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette. Today I'm discussing the results of the 2021 New York City primary elections and what comes next with two expert guests. Dr. Christina Greer, who is a political science professor at Fordham University, and Harry Siegel, who's a senior editor at the Daily Beast, a columnist for the Daily News, and Christina and Harry also co-host the podcast FAQNYC, which is great and you should subscribe to, and I've had the honor of being a guest a few times. Thank you both for being here. Let's dive right in. We have results in almost every city primary, but for a couple of city council recounts going on, but we know the winners for mayor, controller, public advocate, the borough president seats, almost all of the 51 city council seats, and the very competitive and interesting Manhattan district attorney primary. So what happened? What does it all mean? What comes next? Most of these contests were, of course, on the Democratic side, and that's where a lot of our discussion will focus. But there were some Republican primaries, and of course, now we're on to the general election. So Christina, Harry, thank you for being here. As we look at these results, what are some of your big picture takeaways? What are a couple of things you've been thinking about since we got these primary results? Christina, why don't you start us off?
I think the first piece, Ben, and thanks for having us, is I'm still concerned about turnout. I know that we're still in the midst of a global pandemic, but there's something about our municipal elections where so many New Yorkers don't necessarily feel invested in participating. And we know that these city council races, the big three races, mayor, controller, public advocate, for many people, these are stepping stones to other offices. And so we need to be vigilant and pay attention in sort of the entree levels. So that's a great concern for me. I don't really subscribe to, some of the analyses where it's just, progressives are completely out in the city and, we're now just a full Eric Adams camp. I think in many ways it was a race by race, borough by borough, sort of city council district by city council district, where we have to really pick apart these campaigns, how many challengers there were, whether or not this is, an open seat or whether or not people were going up against an incumbent. I don't think we can make sweeping declarations about whether or not AOC has completely lost power or runs the city. And then lastly, I think with Eric Adams, I'm excited to see just how many folks from the de Blasio era he keeps on. I think many people are very afraid that he's going to, make all these sweeping changes. I'm not necessarily convinced that he'll be so different from Bill de Blasio in certain ways. And then the very last piece I'm most excited about, I'm going to say excited about. I want to know who Eric Adams is going to choose as his police commissioner. Once I know that, that to me will give me a better picture of what an Adams mayoralty will look like. When de Blasio, was elected, and obviously he was largely elected on stop and frisk, getting African Americans behind him, and then he appoints Bill Bratton. That to me showed me a lot about who Bill de Blasio was and what his mayoralty would look like. So I'm waiting to see who Eric Adams chooses.
I think all of us here, Harry Siegel included, are very interested in what that pick will look like, as well as, of course, a number of the winners of other primaries, like Jumaane Williams, the public advocate, who's likely to keep his seat and has been so focused on policing and police reform. Eric Adams has, of course, pledged to name a woman as police commissioner, which would make history. Harry, go ahead, jump in.
So we know that Eric Adams has been talking with Bill Bratton a bunch about policing, which is really interesting. And Bratton, who of course was Rudy Giuliani's first police commissioner, and then in the years since, and then decades since, has had this narrative about how he had policing under control and in hand, and then it became a Frankenstein after he left and he came back to fix it. I'm not sure that the de Blasio years entirely back that narrative up, but Adams' conversation with him is very interesting. I think clearly we had something of a split decision in these races. Eric Adams is saying, I'm the face of the Democratic primary, and I'm what's standing between you and the socialists and the communists, and the people who want to defund the police. At the same time, the other citywide officials, Brad Lander and Jumaane Williams, are going to be more progressive. The council races really varied a lot. race by race. Alvin Bragg is going to be the next Manhattan district attorney, which is a huge shift in an office that's changed hands twice in my lifetime up until now. It'll be the first not extremely rich white guy in my lifetime to run that office. So there's a lot happening here. One interesting thing, look, turnout was much better than in 2013, which is a pathetically low bar. But we have this ranked choice system that I think opened things up and is a threat to the Democratic clubhouses. And that's what Eric Adams, for instance, came out of. And the borough presidency, which has a long, interesting history as its role and was a powerful patronage operation and then became a much less powerful patronage operation while continuing to be a springboard for higher office. This does represent the party machine and the clubhouse in certain ways. And many years ago, before any of us were born, New York had a proportional representation system that actually included a ranked choice element. And the result was we ended up with all these fascinating characters getting elected of a sort we haven't seen until very recently. Communists, card-carrying communists, 3 of them in total over the just less than a decade we had this who got in. And this system started actually because Republicans who've been locked out of power signed on for this. Fusion candidates signed on, like LaGuardia, for instance, and said, we need something that opens this up. Ranked choice is supposed to be that, but we have ranked choice only for primaries and special elections, which is ridiculous. So if you're voting for mayor, you're voting one way in the primary, if you're a Democrat, unless your vote matters, because otherwise it basically doesn't. All respect to the, Curtis Slewa and the other sad Republican who was running and was crushed. So there's a real chance to open up our politics and to allow more radical and different voices in this system we have, and I think to increase participation. But so far, the powers that be that have got us this far and have introduced this new system have not done a great job of selling it. They didn't do a great job of explaining it to voters. They haven't done a great job of explaining why it matters. And by splitting the baby in the bathwater and having this only for primaries, they've made it so that a ton of the citizens in New York are still functionally disenfranchised or excluded from our politics and the decision making there. And I think that's a really unhealthy and probably not sustainable dynamic. And lastly, I think will help the people who want to get rid of ranked choice voting, which, by the way, includes many of Eric Adams' allies who actually sued to stop the system, is going to give them ammunition. And last thing, look, Adams would have won by more if not for this system. And that's one of the interesting results. And one of the fights against proportional representation and now ranked choice voting is it makes it harder to vote against a candidate. Like, I think Rudy is a disaster. I'll take anyone else, or Eric Adams is. And that is more difficult to do when your vote carries over than when you do have some sort of hard Manichaean choice to make.
All right, Christina, if there's any of Harry's many points that you want to jump in on, go ahead. But I wanted to also ask you, there are several things that Harry said that I want to dig in on. But when we start at the top of the ticket with Eric Adams' win in the primary, wanted to get your thoughts on what you think the biggest factors in that result were. Why was he able to pull this off? He had a lot of advantages, obviously. What do you point to most when people who don't follow politics so closely say, hey, how did he do it?
Right. I mean, obviously I get lots of calls from people who don't live in New York City or people who do live in New York City. It's like, how is this possible? Mm-hmm. And to me, it's pretty clear cut. One, when you look at, say, the big 8 candidates, only 2 had ever held elected office before. That's Eric Adams and that's Scott Stringer. And we know that running a campaign takes time and it takes practice. Maya Wiley and Catherine Garcia, yes, ran great campaigns. They'd never held elected office before. And I think that there's something about just that process where it gave Eric Adams and, to a certain point in time, Scott Stringer somewhat of an advantage. If you look at the political map, and, all of us love Stephen Romolowski from CUNY Grad Center and the maps that he puts together for us, when you look at Manhattan, say below 125th Street and the gentrifying parts of Brooklyn that we know well, all 3 of us, you see that Catherine Garcia, Maya Wiley, Sean Donovan, Ray McGuire to a certain extent, and Scott Stringer were all battling for those particular areas. That pretty much left Eric Adams with much of the outer boroughs and communities that oftentimes aren't spoken to Many of them felt ignored by de Blasio and definitely by Michael Bloomberg. So you're looking at 20 years of voters who definitely didn't feel like a candidate or an elected official was listening to them and catering to their needs. And then when you listen more closely to how Eric Adams articulates his vision for New York City, there's so many, I always use the word frequency. It's what people hear when they hear him speak. And when he says Black Lives Matter, that resonates with a particular crowd. When he says it can't just be, cops versus Black people, we have to deal with Black on Black crime. It's a very conservative talking point that many Black voters subscribe to, many white voters subscribe to as well. So his strategy of not targeting the same neighborhoods that 6 candidates were spending all of their time in, even though they're high propensity voting neighborhoods, and really going out and not just reigniting the interest of certain voters, but also introducing new people into the voting rolls. And as Harry mentioned, the numbers in 2013 for turnout were so abysmal. We beat those numbers. Those numbers still aren't great. Just because they're better than the horrific numbers we saw in 2013, we still basically got a quarter of the voting eligible population that bothered to turn out for one of the most important races in New York City, because we know that the New York City mayor is not just a New York figure, but a national and in many ways an international figure as well. So Eric Adams' win isn't terribly shocking. I don't think that it's a lot about him being the second Black mayor. That really didn't come across in a lot of ways. You had 2 other pretty qualified Black candidates. That to me doesn't really seem to be the secret sauce behind Eric Adams. I think for a lot of voters, his insider-outsider status of being a police officer and possibly being able to work with the NYPD in ways that Bill de Blasio wasn't, in ways that many people feared, say, a Maya Wiley or a Catherine Garcia wouldn't be able to because of either gender or race or some of the rhetoric that they had used on the campaign trail, made some people who really care about policing think about Eric Adams as a secret weapon in trying to detangle this really complex issue of policing in various neighborhoods across the city.
Go ahead, Harry. You want to add to that?
I agree with everything Professor Greer said. I often do. But let's have fun for a minute here. Eric Adams raised a ton of money really early. He lined up union endorsements. He picked a lane, and then he said all those things, and he messaged those ways. He chose where to campaign. And this race was very close, in part because of the ranked choice system. We're talking about 10,000 votes here. I'm not sure if there was any messaging mix that necessarily would have changed those results in a very split city. I think he came in with a significant head start that wasn't immediately obvious because Scott Stringer was also there competing in a bunch of the same lanes for money and institutional support, particularly because Andrew Yang absorbed much too much attention. And then after Stringer was effectively eliminated from real contention, although he kept running, after a first harassment claim and then a second one came out against him and his progressive validators left, Adams was in a very strong position there. So we all think about the messaging a lot, and we're talking about and writing narrative, but if you squint past the messaging, Eric Adams was very strong to start with, finished just strong enough, and as we know from Bill de Blasio, for instance, who narrowly wins a crazy 5-way primary because of Anthony Weiner, because of hidden money, which everyone had this year, but he was the only guy who had in 2013, a bunch of other stuff. You win by a tiny bit, you crush whatever rando Republican. And by the way, Curtis Sliwa is about 1 billion times more of a rando than Joe Lotus, a serious, accomplished person. And then you say, I have an overwhelming mandate. And that's true on paper, but it's not so clear what that means. And again, because we have such a small share of the city that's actually making these decisions in the system as we have it set up, even if ranked choice has increased that a bit, it's complicated to say that that's really a mandate to run the whole city. And that's what Adams is going to have to do. And message-wise, at least, I think, is off to a wonderful job in this general election / proto victory lap and talking about what he's about and what he wants to do. Of course, we'll see when the rubber hits the road, when he has a commissioner, when it is his NYPD, when it is his budget, what this all actually means in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have this remarkable possibility of this former NYPD captain who has been a police reformer from within, but also talking a lot about how to get, tougher on the certain kinds of crime like gun violence that are rising, appointing a police commissioner and the possibility, at least, of a real city hall police department partnership that doesn't seem like it's Bill de Blasio trying to rein in his NYPD while maybe being okay with everything they're doing, but not quite saying that. This relationship that's been really strained and confusing and challenging and not good for New Yorkers in a number of ways. There's a real opportunity here for a different system if it's possible. This could be a version of that, depending on who Eric Adams, if he is victorious in the general election, does name as police commissioner. Just sticking with Adams's win here for another minute. He really won Black and Latino neighborhoods in the city, and then some sort of outer borough, white, moderate, conservative, democratic bastions that still exist that were sort of the Bloomberg Democrats per se. He really dominated in those areas. And then you had Catherine Garcia doing so well in many parts of Manhattan, parts of Brownstone, Brooklyn, Maya Wiley doing really well in the sort of Brooklyn, Queens, gentrification belt, for lack of a better term. What does that sort of 3-area geography say about where the city is politically? What does Eric Adams need to do if he's going to be the next mayor to sort of reach out to people that didn't vote for him? Does he have to do that, Christina? How do you sort of think about this fractured political landscape? Catherine Garcia and Maya Wiley were also saying a lot of similar things Eric Adams was saying, but they were also saying some very different things. And one of the biggest things to me that voters, I think, in the areas that really voted for Catherine Garcia wanted was just sort of competent, no drama government without having to worry about big egos and, the mayor versus the governor and some of these things that we've seen. And I don't know that that's something we're going to get with Eric Adams as mayor, but what do you make of this divided political map that was different in other races?
Yeah.
The roller race with Brad Lander was a different story, but go ahead.
Well, when I think of Eric Adams, I definitely don't think of no drama. So we might be in for a very exciting 4 years. This to me, I think, goes to something that Harry said. Keep in mind, Eric Adams won, but he doesn't have an overwhelming mandate. We have barely 25% of the voting eligible population that bothered to show up, and he got just a little bit over 40% of that small population. So that's definitely not the city. But for the people that, definitely voted for Adams and are Adams supporters, they actually do understand this complex nuance that de Blasio started in a conversation in 2013 of, I don't want police coming into my community, cracking skulls, stopping and frisking me or my children or my family members. But at the same time, in certain communities, there's rising crime. Certain crimes are quite rampant, whether it's violent or petty, depending on the neighborhood. And so we actually do need to have some sort of relationship with the police. So this idea of just completely abolishing the police or defunding the police is not attractive to many of the Eric Adams supporters, because they're saying we actually have real world issues in our community and we want more policing. We just want good policing. Why can't we have that? And so it's a real nuanced conversation that I think Eric Adams was able to tap into. With Maya Wiley, many of her proposals came from a place of compassion. Obviously, she sort of backed into the progressive label when Dianne Morales' campaign quasi-collapsed, and then Scott Stringer's sort of kind of left Maya Wiley as the last woman standing of the 3 progressive candidates. And I would argue that she was the least progressive of those 3. But, when her critics would sort of try and flesh out some of her policies, they framed them as either idealistic or, from a policy perspective, how will we actually get others to buy into some of her policies, which I think may have scared off some voters at the very end. And then someone like Catherine Garcia, her supporters, get bristled when I say this, but she's a bit of a Trojan horse to me. She's spoken enough kind of vague sentiments policy-wise, in my estimation, what I heard, when you want to streamline government. What does that really mean? Because oftentimes when you streamline government, poor people get left out in the cold. So I do think that there's a certain level of efficiency and competence that Catherine Garcia portrayed. There's still a little bit of uncertainty, especially since she had never held elected office, which I think made some voters question, well, how will we get to this point? Because we haven't necessarily seen how she's worked beyond a commissioner in a more executive role. which kind of leaves, again, as you and Harry have said, it's not an overwhelming mandate for Adams, but it's enough of a window where he's able to, with the addition of money, he's able to put that message out there for either undecided voters or voters who have known him, support him, and feel like he's going to be a fighter. And I mean, I think you can look at the energy of Eric Adams and know many voters in New York have been frustrated by de Blasio's quasi-laissez-faire attitude and the fact that he's been almost everywhere but New York for certain years of his mayoralty. And Eric Adams doesn't seem like he's that kind of guy. He wants to be in New York. He wants to clearly be in Brooklyn, and he wants to fight for New Yorkers. And I think that's the message they heard from him.
Harry, what seems to really have mattered in this election cycle? What endorsements, what factors, what about candidates? To me, we did get this hodgepodge of results with the mayoral race. And to add to what Christina just said, a lot of Catherine Garcia's talking points were not that far from Eric Adams's. So, there is clearly sort of a like thinking among at least those candidates and many of the voters that voted for them. But, as I look across this landscape of the results from the mayoral race comptroller, where the leftist candidate, Brad Lander, combined the sort of Catherine Garcia map and the Maya Wiley map to win, showing us the sort of different possibilities for winning a citywide Democratic primary. And of course, Andrew Yang had been banking on a different map when he was trying to put together his coalition. I look at the borough president races that were very interesting. I look at this hodgepodge of city council results. One of the biggest things I keep coming back to is that the candidates themselves still really matter, and that there are aspects of the way that voters respond to candidates, their charisma, their intelligence, of course, sometimes, their stances on issues, but it's not always that. But then there's other factors as well. What really mattered in this election cycle in your estimation?
As we were talking about, putting in the work to line up money, endorsements, to run a tight campaign, I think really mattered. I think that greatly benefited Eric Adams. I think it greatly benefited Brad Lander when Corey Johnson, the city council speaker, Lander having been a council member, tried to Bigfoot into that race late and sort of use the power of his office, his charisma as a candidate, and suspicions about the left to push through, and fell significantly short. In the mayor's race, I'd add that I think race really mattered. White voters and Manhattan voters were really suspicious of Adams and eager to find an alternative, and they ended up going behind Garcia, who I don't think ran a particularly race-baiting campaign. Adams was upset at the end when she entered into an alliance with Yang. I think that had to do more with the vagaries of how the ranked choice voting thing worked and the tactics that came in. But she definitely soaked up support from people who did not want Adams, and I don't think can fully articulate policy reasons why that was the case. There were questions about where Adams lived and his real estate holdings and how he dealt with money and other things that came up over the race that are part of the price you pay, by the way, for being a successful elected official who's done political business for a really long time, as opposed to someone running for the first time. Some of the compromises you made and the paper trails those leave. And conversely, I think a lot of Black voters and significantly Latino voters were just comfortable with Adams, who was messaging, in many cases, a broadly similar set of ideas, sometimes with somewhat different emphases, and saying, we know this guy. He's been around. We've seen him in action over years and over decades and in different roles, and he seems fine and like somebody who can play this part.
So in our last few minutes here, and we're definitely going to have to all get together again to talk about the transition as that happens in the fall. But Christina, in terms of other factors, other actors, as in entities that mattered here in this election cycle, the New York Times editorial board seems to have mattered quite a bit. You both pointed to labor unions at least mattering some, it seems. Some of the big ones that rallied behind Eric Adams early seemed to really have helped him, including through some outside spending, where he vastly outspent Garcia and Wiley when it comes to both campaign and outside spending. What else do you think mattered in the election? Anything else we haven't mentioned yet?
Well, I just want to tackle onto something that Harry said, and I think I can back into your question, because Race, I do think mattered to a certain extent in this election, but I think class as well. We can't forget Eric Adams is the type of Black candidate that we don't oftentimes see running for executive office. The political science literature calls them new style candidates. Think about Cory Booker, Hakeem Jeffries, Barack Obama, Adrian Fenty. These are all men who have a certain pedigree from academic institutions. They speak a certain way. They make white voters, especially white voters of the political class and a certain socioeconomic status, feel very good about themselves. Eric Adams was able to win in New York City without them. And so I think there's a collective nervousness that you have from, say, the New York Times endorsement crowd and the New York Times readers, right, who by and large supported people like Catherine Garcia or Maya Wiley, because Eric Adams doesn't owe them anything, right? Where he got his money is not from them. They didn't vote for them, and they're used to not only having a seat at the table, but having a seat at the head of the table. And so now that Eric Adams is there with a very different style, right? We talk about this a lot in the literature. It's the style of Black male leaders, especially, that can get a little sticky when it comes to executive roles in cities. And this isn't something that New Yorkers have seen. I think the closest kind of personality style might be a Giuliani, a little bit more in your face, but we're not comparing Dinkins to Adams. I would say that Al Bragg is a little bit more of a David Dinkins character. So when we have to remember that Eric Adams is something new and foreign to the political voting class when it comes to Black executive leadership. And that's going to be the piece that I'm fascinated with because I've already seen how so many journalists are writing about Eric Adams and they're not understanding the race and class elements of how he got into office, how he's been successful for the past 20 years, because so many of the areas where he won aren't sort of priority areas in many of the discussions we've had about city politics. And I think Eric Adams is bringing them into the fold and is putting people at the table who've never been at the table before. So there are going to be some stops and starts, but how Eric Adams works with the established political class, which he knows how to do since he's been an elected official for over 2 decades, but still, it's a little different when you're a borough president than when you are the mayor of New York City and everyone essentially looks to you.
We should start a new half hour just on that point because there's a lot more to discuss there. And next time we'll have to have a couple hours to discuss, but we have to leave it there on that very important and interesting point. And we'll pick back up there, I think, when we're talking about either the general election next time we get together or a transition period. Thank you both very much. Dr. Christina Greer, Harry Siegel, thank you for being here. Make sure you subscribe to their podcast, FAQNYC. Thank you for watching Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max from Gotham Gazette. See you next time.